Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ai-Chu Ding, and this is Shuya Xu. This is Jui-Hsin Hung. So this is a project we did in Dr. Farida Pawan's L750 last year. And the purpose of this research is to investigate what are some possible instructional strategies for foreign language teachers to stay in target language and also make that target language input comprehensible. So let's get started. Why do we care about target language input? When in our department we emphasize that we have to honor our students' home language and their home culture, are we in that case to talk about maximizing target language input? No. So there are still studies suggesting that creating a language immersive environment is to maximize the effectiveness of learning target language. Also, from a policy perspective, the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Language actually recommends that the language educator and their students should stay in target language over 90% of the instructional time. And also in terms of foreign language teaching, as we all know, if you are in a foreign language environment, most of the time, most possibly, the classroom is the only place where you can receive target language inputs. And so it is our responsibility as the foreign language teachers to ensure that we maximize this target language input in our foreign language classrooms. Also, if you are a teacher teaching in multilingual classroom, then you have no choice but using the target language as your communication medium. And so in that kind of cases, it is very important that you ensure your target language input is comprehensible to your students. And so considering all these kind of circumstances, it is still very important that we understand how we can maximize our target language input, as well as making it comprehensible. To understand target language input, the input hypothesis by Kreshon is the most important theory we use. So through the input hypothesis, they lay out some of the characteristics that when we are designing the target language input for our students. First, it has to be comprehensible. Second, the input should be only a little bit higher than the current level or the stage of language competence of our language learners. This is also why the target language input from the instructor is so important, because they know their audience language proficiency, their competence. While the language learners are communicating with native speaker of the target language, the input is not organized, not planned. And so in that kind of circumstances, the input might not be as beneficial as those planned target language input. And also, exposing learners to extensive period of comprehensible target language input would also ensure mastery of the target language input. This is what we learned from the input hypothesis by Kreshon. However, unfortunately, the current study on target language input mostly focused on the debate of whether we should use target language all the time in our class. There are a few studies actually investigated to examine whether the current proposed instructional strategy are actually effective from teachers' perspective. And so we coined the term immersion strategies here, the strategies for a teacher to stay in target language effectively as our main focus of this research. And we use the scaffolding theory laid out by Brush and Say. There are two aspects of scaffolding, hard scaffolding and soft scaffolding. So upon reviewing the current literature, we found that most of the instructional strategies talked by the scholars are actually focusing on the hard scaffolding aspect. For example, classroom management and the content delivery, including how you can teach grammar, how you can teach vocabulary, how you can create your activities in class. Those are the aspects that the instructors can plan in advance when they are teaching, when they are organizing their instruction activities. However, the soft scaffolding aspect, the dynamic situation-specific aid provided by a teacher or a peer to help with the learning process is widely ignored in the current literature. What are the soft scaffolding aspects? It is the communication happening in the classroom where the instructors are spot a problem of their learners, and they immediately provide that soft scaffolding for their students. So in our situation, we are looking at the target language input. So we propose that we can use the communication strategy theories as a possible way to sort of develop our instructional scaffolding for communicating with our students in class. What is communication strategy theory? It is actually a line of research that looking at how non-native speakers communicate in the target language to prevent themselves from breaking down. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, you know, to prevent those communication breakdown and what kind of strategies they use. And we are arguing here that this kind of communication strategies used by non-native speakers are actually a possibility for foreign language teachers as an instructional strategy in their class. They can sort of model those communication strategies for their students. And this is also a way for them to stay in target language. So we have these two research questions, and later on, Jui-Hsin and Shuya will going to discuss these two research questions in details. First is, what are some teaching strategies currently used by language teachers for staying in the target language? What are some other strategies for increasing target language input that have not been used by language teachers? Second, how do language teachers perceive the effectiveness and feasibility of the proposed strategies that were identified from the literature? So in our research, we used convenient sampling to recruit our participants. 6 college-level Chinese teachers were included for this research. They are all females, and their teaching experience varied from 6 months to 6 years. And they are all relatively young, aged from 24 years old to 33 years old. And our data collection can be divided into 3 stages. At the first stage, we conducted semi-structured teacher interviews, and we also observed our participants teaching. And from the first stage, observation and interviews, we conduct an initial analysis to see what are some strategies those teachers are currently used to stay in target language. And then we reviewed our literatures and then developed a list of 33 immersion strategies. We also developed an online tutorial for our students. As you can see in the handout we just distributed, those are the 33 strategies, and our online tutorial is actually based on the handout you just received. And so we developed this tutorial to help our participants to get more familiar with those 33 strategies. And we encourage our participants to try out those strategies in their classroom if they haven't been using those strategies. After that, we conduct another follow-up interviews with our participants and ask them how they feel about those strategies, whether they feel it is effective or feasible enough in their classroom. Our data analysis is based on the grounded theory. We use open coding, and the unit of analysis is at the sentence level. We triangulate each of our data. We include at least 2 data sources for each of our research questions. Also, while we are doing the coding, the 3 researchers will code the transcripts individually, separately, and then we will come together to discuss and reach the agreement of those coding. Yeah. And now, Jui-Hsin and Shuya is going to share our research findings.
Here I am to introduce the results for our first research question here to you. What are the strategies that have been used by teachers and have not been used by teachers? In the first round of interview, we asked the teachers, our participants, open-ended questions like, how do you stay in target language? What do you do in your class? And from their answers, we identified this list of strategies that were used in their teaching practice. When they are preparing their lesson, they pay attention to the detail level of their lesson plan. In terms of classroom management, they try to establish agreement students aware of class procedures. When they are delivering their instruction, they use all the following strategies. Overall, they try to make their input as comprehensible as possible. For example, by using slower speech rate or provide multimodal input. They also try to establish a Chinese-speaking environment in the class, and they scaffold the students to make output in target language as much as possible. And in our second round of interview, we came up to the teachers with a list of strategies that we identified from the literature. We asked them one by one, have you used this strategy in your class, and how do you feel of it? And from the data, we identified these 8 strategies as most frequently used by the teachers. They were reported as being regularly used by all the 4 teachers. They are setting the stage from day one, borrowing or code switching, controlled vocabulary and idioms, controlled sentence length and complexity, modeling, giving examples and a demonstration, body language and gestures, minimizing the time spent on grammar explanation, and guiding students from more simple to more complex responses. If you are interested in to know more about these strategies, you can refer to the handout. There are definitions for each of the strategies. And following this, we also found 7 strategies that were frequently used, which were reported as being regularly used by 3 out of 4 teachers. They are establishing classroom routine, pacing, comprehension check, repetition, slower speech rate, fostering a classroom culture that values communication and accuracy more than prescriptive rule, and a written form of procedural instruction in the student's first language. Besides this, we also found 3 strategies that were least used by the teachers. They were reported as never used by more than 3 teachers. The 3 strategies are classroom decorations and arrangements, starting the class with learning objectives, and the PACE model, which refers to the presentation, attention, co-construction, and extension process. After we got all those data, we tried to compare the strategies from teaching practice and the strategies from literature. And our results showed these 5 strategies emerged from our data, which were not reflected in the literature. The first one is detail level of lesson plan. The teachers we interviewed, they actually script their questions and try to predict what kind of answers they can get from the students so that they can get prepared for target language use to the maximum. The second one is warm up to practice out content. So before the class actually begins, the teacher try to chat with their students in the target language, which is Chinese in our context, and they try to use some of the contents they have learned before in the conversation. So a Chinese speaking mode has been established from the beginning of the class. And the third one is scaffolding the context, which means that the teacher, instead of explaining some complicated concepts in the student's first language, the teacher tried to describe a simple scenario in the target language. And so students can understand the meaning with the help of these cues. And the fourth strategy is error correction by rephrasing or testing. The teachers try to avoid explaining some rules like grammar rules or other kind of rules in English, which is the first language of the students. Instead, they try to model the correct use. And the last strategy is avoid responding to students' question in L1, which is more like a mindset for the teachers to get prepared when and avoid speaking in the first language when unplanned events come up in the classroom. And now, Jui-Hsin is going to introduce the second presentation.
Now, after we have looked at the frequency of the strategy used by the teacher, now we are going to look at the effectiveness and visibility of the strategy perceived by the language instructors. And we will also be looking at some potential factors which may have affected their perception toward these strategies. And here, we would divide the result discussion into 3 different categories based on our categorization of the strategies. And the first category is classroom management strategies. There are two strategies perceived more frequently as effective by the instructor. The first one is establishing classroom routines. This one, our participants gave us an example of routinize the body language. So for example, when they are going to ask the students to repeat after them, they would just use this body gesture, then students would know they need to repeat after the teacher. And classroom decorations and arrangement, this one, because the classroom usually were assigned by the school, so they didn't really have the freedom to decorate their language classroom. But one of the strategy they mentioned is they usually, if they can, they would adopt semicircle seating arrangement. So just like this classroom. So they consider this as a way to decrease the distance between teachers and students and may affect the way they interact with the students and increase the interactions between them. However, this strategy may also be limited. The use of this strategy can also be limited to the room they got assigned for each semester. So maybe they won't be able to allow to use this strategy. Depends on the room. And two strategy perceived as less effective by the teacher are setting the stage from day one and establishing a reward system. But interestingly, our participants mentioned that if you can combine the two strategies together to use, for example, to sign a language pledge on the first day of the class, and then with a punishment or a reward system, then I think the students will be pushed to comply to the language pledge they signed. And the next category is communication strategy. Three strategies are considered as more effective, more frequently perceived as effective, are borrowing or code switching, literal translation, and question downwards. And among the least effective strategies mentioned by our participants, one particularly circumlocution perceived as effective in previous research did not perceive as effective by our participants. And the reason they mentioned is most of their questions are, as Shuya just mentioned, are predetermined scripted questions. So they didn't really have the freedom to try out the strategy, and therefore they have lower expectation of this particular research, this particular strategy. And the last category is delivery of instruction. There are 6 strategies agreed by all the participants as effective, including control vocabulary and idioms, and a similar one in a sentence level, control sentence length and complexity, and modeling, giving examples and demonstration, minimizing the time spent on grammar explanation, which is also not the focus of the drill lesson taught by our participants. Guiding students from more simple to more complex responses. And the last one, concept definition map. Interestingly, this one have never been used by all the participants, but all of them expressed their interest in trying out this strategy. While looking at the strategy effectiveness, it seems to us that the role of the program curriculum and the nature of the class involving in their perception of the strategy. For example, when talk about starting the class with learning objectives, because this is not a duty of the drill teachers, so they did not use this, and therefore they perceive this as less effective. And activity types and numbers were also controlled mainly by the program curriculum, so they did not really spend a lot of time on activities. And therefore, they might also perceive this as less effective. I'm going to just go over a very brief discussion based on the results of this part. First of all, many of the strategies were perceived as effective by the participants, which is consistent with the previous research. However, we did identify some discrepancy from previous research. There are 3 strategies acting out the PACE model and rephrasing perceived as effective but ineffective by our participants. based on different reasons. The first one, acting out students, the participants say this might be more suitable for younger age kids, but they are teaching college level students, so they think maybe this is more less effective. But they also express they have their personal preference. They prefer not to use acting out to teach a language. So here we can see that teachers' preference also play a role in in their perception and whether they use the strategy or not. And the next one, time constraint. PACE model requires more time to complete, so time constraint is a reason. The last one, rephrasing, is said to be more suitable for higher proficiency level students because they are all teaching first level 1. So this is less effective. I'll just skip. Look at the number 4. This is 3 main reasons mentioned by our participants that when they perceive the strategy as less effective, they mention these strategy may be more providing misleading information to the students, which they definitely don't want to, and inappropriate to use in the current context in terms of student proficiency. And the setting, the rooms they are assigned to. And time constraint is always a very important factor considered by the teacher because they have much content to cover, so they have to use strategies saving more time rather than maybe benefit students in one way or the other. So last one I just want to mention, we suggest that in future teacher training program, we can consider some communication strategies to be included in the training process. You can refer to the last 2 pages of your handout to see what is considered by as more effective